Thanks, Geelong Gallery, for inviting me to talk to you this evening. I'd also like to begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I live and work on, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and pay my respects to any elders past and present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are tuning in today. I acknowledge and respect First Nations people's continuing creativity, culture and beliefs, and their ongoing contributions that they make to the life of this country. I don't take for granted that where we are today is stolen land and that sovereignty has never been ceded. For those in the audience tonight that are blind or low vision, I am a woman in my 30s with long, dark, wavy hair, wearing a black jumper against a white background with a graphic print behind me. And I'm so pleased to be able to speak to you tonight about an artist that I've really had the pleasure of getting to know over the past few years in developing the show for Geelong Gallery. As Alicia mentioned, Barbara Brash was a vital artist in NAM Melbourne's post-World War II printmaking revival and the attendant teachings, exhibitions and community that was built around the printed medium during this time. Brash's works were recognised as being some of the best examples of modern approaches to traditional techniques such as etching, linocutting and lithography, and, as she would become renowned for in her mature practice, screenprinting. Through her creative and experimental adaptations of these methods, Brash pushed past established material and aesthetic boundaries in print, her works demonstrating new artistic principles and ideas that were being incorporated into uniquely Australian expressions of the medium. Her artistic career was forged within some of the key artistic training grounds in Melbourne that really shaped the art and art history of this period, namely the National Gallery School, the George Bell School, and the Studio One printmakers that operated out of the Melbourne Technical College, now known as RMIT. And something that I find really interesting is charting the influence of these kinds of generative environments where ideas are shared both formally and informally between students and instructors, creating this wide range of networks that you can see play out in visual echoes between the artists' works, their biographies, and even who exhibited with who. And it's these crossovers and associations that makes the art and artist from this period so interesting to study now, over half a century after it took place. And for me, this wonderful portrait that we see here really underscores this point. It was painted by her good friend and artist, Dorothy Braund, and I think it shows a great understanding of Barbara. It really shines through the close relationship that they had, the crisp angular shirt, sculptural black trousers, and the soft focus of her face, projecting a vision of her as a very serious, stylish and thoughtful artist. And I can change my slide. So in particular, Barbara's use of colour and understanding of rhythm and balance in her image making was held in critical acclaim by writers and curators. Her prints often combining printmaking techniques or developing new ones to impart even more texture and diversity onto the picture plane. Her subject matter was wide-ranging, with early works comprising still lifes and figure studies, small coastal vignettes, or experiments in the arrangements of form and mass. As her confidence grew, she veered further into the abstract realm, creating compositions that express landscape and her encounters with nature through a distillation of form and complex layering. And these are some installation shots from the show at Geelong Gallery, which is organised in a very loosely kind of chronological manner and is designed to kind of show the evolution of her style throughout 3 decades of her practice. At the kind of very left of the top image, you can see some very early linocuts and lithographs, continuing through down to the installation view on the bottom right, which shows these very hard edge abstract styles that emerged in the 1960s and that Barbara was really fascinated with come the 1980s. And I suppose you could say that it is Brash's steadfast originality that was the inspiration for this exhibition. As just mentioned, it surveys 3 decades of her prolific and exploratory body of work, mapping her artistic progression through these training grounds of the Melbourne Gallery School, the George Bell School, and her kind of printmaking collective experience. And it brings together works from the Geelong Gallery collection and also the Colin Holden Charitable Trust, and really is just a celebration of her significant contributions to Australian printmaking. I'd just like to speak about one of the challenges that I encountered in the initial stages of curating this show, and this was the scarcity of secondary materials that really gave an account of Brash's biography or analysed her work in any great detail. And in some ways, this was an opportunity to look at her work from a fresh standpoint and take a really wide lens to the text archives and wider artistic community that was surrounding her at the time. However, there are a few researchers and curators who have already done work in this space and around Barbara. And I would like to acknowledge their work because it's really added to my own understanding of Brash and her artistic persona. So on that note, I'd like to thank Emma Mills, whose honours thesis on Barbara Brash gives a really great comprehensive account of her career and who has also established the first exhibition history for the artist, and Ainsley Gowing from the Mornington Peninsula Regional Gallery, whose 2006 exhibition From Tuesday to Tuesday really brought Brash and the cohort of women printmakers that she created works alongside to life for contemporary audiences. So to begin with a bit of background about Barbara, she was born in Melbourne, Annam, in 1925 and was the first daughter of Elsa and Alfred Brash. And her family was well known in Melbourne as the music retailers that founded Brash's in the late 1890s. This was a business that would expand to selling white goods in the 1950s, but would return to its musical roots. And some of you in the audience might remember visiting these shops as demonstrated in this beautiful Technicolor 80s photograph at the top here. Barbara attended secondary school at St Catherine's in the very wealthy suburb of Toorak in Melbourne, and her presence at parties and social events was occasionally reported on in the social pages of the newspaper. So she was part of a coterie of very wealthy and privileged people in Melbourne of the era. According to family members, she never really participated in the family business, but as evidenced by the small gouache on the bottom right, which is in the collection of the NGV, she did find points to kind of marry her own creativity with the more mercantile aspects of her family background. So Barbara's artistic inclinations may be attributed to both sides of her family. And she's quoted as saying in Mary Eagle and Jan Minchin's book on the George Bell School that, and I quote, "My mother had been to the Slade School in London and painted miniatures. So did her sister. After leaving school, I thought I would try commercial art," end quote. And whilst more research is required to uncover the specificities of this very singular mention to her mother and aunt's kind of creative exploits in Europe, on Barbara's father's side, a really clear connection to the Australian Impressionist movement has already been traced. So going back a couple of generations in the Brash family tree, we arrive at Barbara's great aunt, Golda Figa Brash, who married Lewis Abrahams, who was a founding member of the Heidelberg School in 1888. And in about 1890, Barbara's great uncle Reuben Brash, who we see on the left here wearing the hat, who was a successful and well-known retailer who had a department store on Oxford Street in Sydney. He established the Curlew Artists Camp in Sirius Cove in Mossman, which is at the northern side of Sydney Harbour. And Reuben and his brothers used to escape to this area of pristine bushland on the weekends, eventually inviting a kind of colony of artists and creatives to live and work there. And it was a very comfortable bohemian existence, kind of underscored by the wealth of Reuben and his family. There were tents furnished with the, gorgeous cane furniture. Paper lamps were kind of strewn throughout. Lengths of fabric were kind of used to make a very homely atmosphere. There was even a billiards table, a tent, as we see in the lower kind of picture, and a cook and handyman were kept on staff. So no expense spared was kind of the feature of this, very well-to-do artists camp, and made it really appealing for some artists, really significant artists of the time, to take up residence there. So it was here at Ceres Cove that some of the most recognised artists of the era, such as Arthur Streeton and Tom Roberts, worked on paintings on plein air that captured the camp's idyllic natural setting, and also provided vantage points for some of the most iconic depictions of the coast surrounding Sydney. It has also been suggested that the long vertical format that Streeton adopted in his works from this time was influenced by the cedar panels that Barbara Brash provided to the artists. And these were kind of refuse from the pallets and the boxes that came through his department store. So it's interesting how these very incidental kind of meetings and things that would be cast away rubbish kind of transform into these great artistic moments in Australian art history. Lastly, rounding out this portion of the familial connection to art and artists at the turn of the century was another of Brash's great aunts, Selina Venus Brash, who was an actress, a singer, even a songwriter and a poet, who was also a model for Tom Roberts and some of the artists working in Sydney at the time. And her likeness can be seen in all of these works here, including the work on the bottom right, which is included in the NGV's significant Impressionism exhibition from a few years ago. But turning back to the artist at hand, Barbara Brash began her artistic education at the Melbourne Technical College in 1945, and she actually completed 1 year of a commercial art diploma before switching to the National Gallery School the following year. And here I've included the roll call for the School of Painting at the National Gallery School, and you'll see some familiar names highlighted in addition to Barbara's at the top here. And this is just to give you an indication of who she was coming up with, who was learning about the same things at the same time. And it's really fascinating to go through this document and see how many artists that we know today kind of came up through this school, using it as a grounding for their further exploits. And so Brash joined the gallery school at a time of kind of upheaval and critical staffing changes that would signal the advent of the modernist influence in Melbourne's leading artistic academy. As the newly appointed head, William Dargy created 3 streams of classes in response to a widespread desire for the school to start teaching the new modernist principles that were coming out of Europe at the time. And Alan Sumner was brought onto the staff at this time, and he is credited with being really the first modernist artist to take up residence in a teaching capacity at the school. So Brash, along with her childhood friend, Dorothy Braund, the artist who created that wonderful portrait at the start of my presentation, became part of the group that Sumner taught, and they were known as Sumner's Kids, as we can see in this gorgeous photo. And I love these kind of kooky ties and bows that they're all wearing. But again, we see Brash at the far right of this group wearing this kind of demure face, which I think is quite interesting when we consider her kind of commitment to her career in later years. And as I'll go on to explain later on in my talk, Alan Sumner is an artist that has really emerged as an important touchstone for Brash, particularly as her career progressed. He was a multidisciplinary artist, known primarily for his work in stained glass, but he also produced screen prints throughout the 1940s and 50s. And at this time, screen printing was primarily associated with kind of advertising and commercial output. And it was potentially in seeing Sumner's first exhibition of screen prints in 1946 that Brash really started thinking about it in a fine art context. And although it would take her until about 1958, 1959 to start creating screen prints of her own, you can really see Sumner's influence, as you'll see in later slides, on her kind of burgeoning polychromatic and really kind of interesting, diverting picture planes. At the head of this modernist movement in Melbourne was George Bell, and he was a really critical artist and teacher whose studios in Burke Street and in Selborne Road in Toorak were really vital pedagogical training grounds of some of the most feted artists from the inter and post-war years. Artists such as Russell Drysdale, Constance Stokes and Sally Herman all came through Bell's school, and his influence was really widely felt both in Melbourne and Sydney. And as a previous student of Bell, Sumner encouraged his students to attend classes with the senior artist as a way of kind of extending their visual vocabulary and experimenting with different media. So Brash had completed most of her first year at the National Gallery School before deciding to supplement her artistic training at Bell's Academy. And she was part of a group of friends, including Dorothy, also Michael Shannon and Mary McQueen, that would leave their Friday afternoon classes at the National Gallery School and kind of catch the tram down St Kilda Road and end up at Bell's. And it was here that she was kind of immersed into the broader philosophy of modern art. So Bell's teachings emphasise composition as an essential basis for art making. And he cited the work of French post-impressionist painter Paul Cézanne as a prime example of how artists should aim to order their material, to infuse it with an idea and impart rhythm to its structure. So by concentrating on these formal aspects of works by these predecessors, he impressed upon his students that modernism was essentially a return to the ideas of formal design or true classicism and the enduring importance of structure in artistic expression. And in his own practice, this is illustrated in works such as Toinette from 1934, as we see on the right hand of the slide here. And this very front-on painting displays Bell's use of artistic invention in the way that he distills forms to these very simple shapes. We see like a very oval head, this cylinder of a neck and the triangle of the hair. And there's very little modelling of the face in general. So really letting these kind of forms speak for themselves within the painting. And this approach was encouraged by Bell in his lessons, and he really advocated for imaginative and intelligent expressions of subject matter and stressed the importance of formal arrangement to produce these harmonious designs that could really be fit for the modern era. From Bell, Brash also learnt and inherited the principle of dynamic symmetry. And this is a mathematical division of pictorial space into a grid of rectangles and intersecting diagonal lines that's designed to promote harmony and flow throughout the picture plane. And the shape and feel generated by dynamic symmetry, which is also known as the golden rule or the golden section, is a defining characteristic of many of the works that she produced during the 50s and 60s. And it kind of gives a really pleasing purposeful asymmetry and arrangement to her compositions as they kind of veered more purposefully towards the abstract realm. And you can see the influence of dynamic symmetry in these works, which I've superimposed with the one iteration of this very complex compositional grid. In Seated Woman, which is the work on the left, the eye is drawn up from the sole of the figure's foot at the bottom right. And there's a diagonal tension created through the diagonal line that goes up from the bottom right to the top left, kind of following the shape of her dress and then curving around her shoulder and into her hair. And you can see that these kind of major elements of the composition kind of correlate to the intersections of these lines. So for example, her right hand resting against the arm of the chair, and also the kind of base of her chin there. And in Harbour, the work on the right, I kind of follows a similar circular kind of path around this work, starting from the black and yellow landmass, kind of going counterclockwise. And you can kind of see how it loosely follows these diagonal lines around the picture plane. So at Bell's, an interest in graphic design and the applied arts, it was really a natural extension to his belief in design. And whilst George Bell never taught printmaking, he encouraged many of his students to experiment with the medium from the 1930s. And his interest in printmaking really prefaces the renewed passion for printmaking that spread throughout Melbourne's art schools and galleries from the late 40s into the 60s, which Brash was a part of. And this enthusiasm was partly due to emigre artists and returning expatriates arriving in the city and sharing their experiences of European printmaking and their training in these schools overseas with eager Australian practitioners. And local established artists are also to be credited with this groundswell, among them Ben Croskell, who was key to the revival of etching as a fine art practice. So Ben Croskell, he studied with the prominent Australian etcher, John Shirlow. He began teaching Saturday morning etching classes at the Melbourne Tech in 1948. And it was in these lessons that Brash experienced her first foray into printmaking. And her memory of this nexus in her career is kind of hilarious, but also really indicative of the limited knowledge of printmaking amongst the art students of the time. And conversely, the seemingly organic dissemination of its methods throughout this cohort. So when asked in an interview what compelled her to try etching in the first place, she stated, quote, "I don't know. I didn't know anything about it. Someone said my drawings looked like an etching and I didn't know what that was," end quote. So these classes would really be the beginning of Brash's long association with the Melbourne Tech, and also the wide network of artists that created work therein. So it was around this time also that Brash debuted as a professional artist at the opening exhibition of the Stanley Co Gallery in Melbourne in February in 1950. And she was represented with one work, but importantly, she showed alongside important modernists of the era, such as George Bell and Alan Sumner and Constance Stokes, as well as younger artists such as her friend Dorothy Braund, and also familiar names like John Brack and Leonard French. She took a trip to Europe with Dorothy after they'd both completed their studies at the National Gallery School in 1950, and they stayed in Europe for about a year. And whilst Brash never undertook any formal study during this time, it was an important point in her artistic development because it was at this time that she saw for herself the works by Renaissance artists that Bell also held up as exemplars of the classical modernist style. And this quote by Dorothy at the top of the slide really underscores Barbara's eye for movement and spatial relationships in art, and her belief in Bell's teachings of how an image should be constructed according to form to achieve its best advantage, kind of thing. And I'll quote from the passage at the top of the slide. She was vitally interested in the relationship of figures to space, subordinating the clothing of figures to a sweeping rhythm of drapery to flow within the constructed cause of the composition, end quote. And these three photos you see at the bottom of the slide are some of the only surviving evidence that I could find in kind of publicly accessible collections. And I just think they're great, so stylish, two friends just traveling around Europe together. Sounds pretty great. So when Barbara returned to Europe in 1951, she began frequenting the Melbourne Tech again, and this time to attend weekly group evening sessions in printmaking with Harold Freeman. And it's at this point that her involvement with printmaking collectives and the groups that kind of formed within the Melbourne Tech would begin to have a profound effect upon her career. So in 1952, Brash became involved with a circle of artists based at the Tech, called the Melbourne Printmakers Group, or the Friedman Group. And due to a shortage of printmaking equipment after World War II, Harold Freeman and Ben Croskell invited artists to spend evenings using the college's facilities. And really, it was Harold Freeman that's credited with introducing printmaking to the college's curriculum in 1948, and has been described as being responsible for the initiation of a great forward movement of printmaking in Australian art. These classes were offered on an invite-only basis and became the focal point for the city's experimental printmaking production. And here Brash learnt the techniques for a variety of printmaking methods, including etchings, lithographs, and linocuts, and became a respected participant in what were remembered as vibrant and stimulating gatherings. Brash regularly attended Freeman's Tuesday evening sessions with a number of other artists. The technical assistance and availability of specialist materials such as presses and lithographic stones, and importantly, people who knew how to use them, attracted the participation of some of the most celebrated post-war Australian artists, including Arthur Boyd and Charles Blackman. As a more seasoned printmaker than her cohort, Brash's adeptness in the relief printing methods was really helpful for less practiced members. And I'll just go back to my slide. Here on the right, we see an example of one of the linocuts she produced during this time. These really sketchy planes of colour and this curious interplay of positive and negative space kind of shows her really grappling with the graphic possibilities of the medium, and is one of my favourite works in the show. So the Friedman Group presented an exhibition titled 40 Prints by 10 Artists at the Peter Bray Gallery in 1954, which was opened by the Keeper of Prints at the NGV, Dr. Ursula Hoff. And she would be kind of vital also to Brash's career, providing access to the NGV print room for students to come and view the NGV's kind of awesome collections of prints, kind of that kind of inspiring matriarch of the print world. And here we see a lithograph reproduction of Brash's linocut print, Native Dancer, that was used as the poster art for the show. And this, putting her work as the kind of visual identity for the show was really a gesture that signalled the respect that this group had for her technical command of the medium. And as we see here, this work was specially mentioned by this reviewer, who notes Brash's exceptional gifts in colour, composition and form. So in 1960, Irish artist Tate Adams was in charge of the new postgraduate printmaking course at RMIT. And like Friedman, he made the print room, along with new lithographic and etching facilities, available for a select number of artists to use one night a week. And this core group, which included Brash, Tate Adams, Janet Dawson, Fred Williams, Graham King, Hertha Klugpot and Jan Sengbergs, named themselves the Studio One Group. And interestingly, Brash was the only quote unquote local member who was a part of the group, in that she hadn't trained overseas. And that, I think, really reinforces her already solid standing in the print community. And this evidently secured her a place within the group. Amongst the wider group associated with the classes and output of the Melbourne Tech were a core group of women artists, Brash forming friendships and creating and exhibiting works alongside Mary McQueen, Nancy Clifton and Lesbia Thorpe into the 1960s. And it was within this wider kind of porous and experimental milieu, and with the backing of Bell's formal and design sensibility, that Brash's own kind of individual modernist vernacular would take full flight. She exhibited regularly in galleries across Australia during the 1950s and 60s, and her works appeared in numerous exhibitions at the Peter Bray Gallery and the Victorian Artists Society galleries, most often in the company of the various art and printmaking collectives with which she was associated. And her works really received a lot of positive critical attention in the era. Reviews from the time praising her feel for planning, texture and harmony, her ability to devise radiating compositions and superb formal and tonal control. And Brash continued to work from the Melbourne Tech for several years and started producing screen prints from about 1958, 1959. And screen prints are really a critical element to understanding Brash's mature practice, with her avid interest in the technique reflecting its growing popularity in fine art circles. And as I suggested earlier, it was the prints created by her former instructor Alan Sumner, together with her year of commercial training, and just kind of being in the context of the Melbourne Tech, where they were having commercial art kind of training sessions in various mediums. All of these kind of influences drew Brash's interest to the creative potential of the medium. And one of her early works was deemed to share synergies with the technique. The prominent modernist critic Alan McCulloch noting that her painting Woman Seated from 1953 in the George Bell Group exhibition from that year had the, quote, forthright quality of a vividly stenciled fabric design. So if Sumner is to be credited with elevating the technique of screen printing to the realm of fine art, with the use of carefully graded inks and producing a really painterly effect in ink, Brash's screen prints should be recognised for propelling it into complex aesthetic and technical territory. From the late 1960s, she worked almost exclusively in the medium, her works employing colour to its full effect, freely combining areas of rich tonal washes with solid hued planes. By varying the degrees of transparency and manipulating the register, or the way that printed elements are aligned within her compositions, she exploited the chromatic and textural possibilities that could be achieved. In Sea Fringe from 1963, the work on the right, the optical effect of a mirage is produced through Brash's use of multiple screens to build up a diffused gauze-like sensibility. The Japanese paper selected for the support lends a delicacy and sheen to the inks applied, and a gently rippled ocean surface is suggested by the intersplicing sections of blue, grey and yellow. Bold colours are overlaid over this background, with abstract accents sweeping the imagery into a cohesive whole. Brash maintained the choice of colour for this work was intuitive. She is quoted as saying that the paper itself seemed to suggest the colour I used, with the effect of fading light hitting the water further enhanced by this tapering line of orange and yellow that kind of enters into the work at the bottom left. A turning point in Brash's screen printing production occurred in 1963 when she moved out of the family home in Toorak into a house of her own. And this was a decision that would correspond with her gradual withdrawal from the exhibiting and studio collectives that she was previously very active in. From her new home and studio at 735 Toorak Road in Kooyong, she continued to apply the skills and techniques gained over the past decade, adapting them where necessary to achieve heightened formal and textural effects in the context of her increasingly experimental practice. At this time, she was selected amongst all of the other Studio One printmakers by Daniel Thomas, who was a curator at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, to participate in the watershed exhibition called the Australian Print Survey of 1963. And this exhibition toured all major Australian cities over these 2 years, 1963 and 64. And really alerted the public to a generation of artists who engaged across both figurative and abstract subject matter to express the modern Australian experience. And I don't have a good image of the work Brash contributed to the show, unfortunately, but it was a very complex semi-abstract silk screen or screen print made with 16 separate stencils. But instead, I have this gorgeous piece of correspondence between Daniel Thomas and Barbara, just because I think it indicates her personality so well and how seriously she took herself as an artist. You know, so many annotations and various questions about why he wants to know that information really signals an artist that knows that this will be recorded for posterity and will be how people engage with their work in future generations. So it's possible that the exposure generated by this major exhibition resulted in Brash's first solo exhibition in 1965 at the Australian Galleries in Collingwood. And here we see an article that explains her process in the lead up to this show, which describes how a converted laundry mangle was kind of made into a printing press. And this allowed her to test new ways of printing on her own terms. And converting laundry mangles was quite a common practice for artists during this era, kind of suiting people who couldn't afford to create work in the context of a print studio, or who simply just didn't want to participate in that kind of collective making activity. So I think, again, this removal of her from these networks is also signalled by her investment in the kind of the materials needed to create work by herself. And it was from this article, and in particular the description of the embossed print that Brash had created using this mangle, that you can see on the bottom left of this slide, that the term holding form kind of took hold of my own mind and as a potential motif for this show, holding form at Geelong Gallery. So whilst also referring to her modernist training and understanding of how form is used to impart logic and balance to a composition, this phrase also signifies the way that Brash, she didn't conform to the expected trajectory of her gender or her social class by abandoning her career in favour of marriage and a family, and really signals her creative perseverance within the male-dominated art world of post-World War II Australia. So this debut solo show of hers received really great reviews, two in particular, and one that I've included here, where Alan McCulloch kind of holds the flame again for Brash, and he singles out her contributions to Australian printmaking. And I've just used this image of this very virtuosic and impactful screen print of A Bird of Paradise to kind of indicate where this quote is coming from. And if I go to the next slide, you'll see an installation shot of 4 of the works that were included in this show. And this was a part of a series, one of the most kind of individual and idiosyncratic series that Brash made of these birds. So it was a series called Birds from Australia, New Guinea and the World. And you can kind of see how she commits to reimagining the form of the bird through these combinations of colour and mass and intersecting line. And it's wonderful to have these 4 works of this series back together again in the context of the show. Amongst the most pioneering of her methods was thermography, which is a process like screen printing, which was primarily associated with commercial printing output at the time Brash started to experiment with it. From the late 1960s to the early 70s, Brash adopted thermography to incorporate texture into her screen prints. And this thermography is a method of creating a raised, often glossy surface on the paper without distorting it, and is generally used to emboss commercial objects like business cards or letterhead. And here I've included an image of the work Promontory and a few details showing these thermographed sections, as well as some areas where Brash has kind of scraped back the ink to reveal the support below. In doing so, in using these kind of erasures and also raising of the texture in her prints, she's able to convey a broader range of tone and visual interest in what is already a complex and kind of heavily worked print. I've yet to encounter another artist from this period who uses the technique of thermography. So Brash may well be kind of a singular artist in this respect. And I would really love to see further research done on this material aspect of her work. To finish up, because I realise we're almost at the end of our session, it's important to note that Brash would continue to produce works right up until her death in 1998, including a series based on her travels around outback Australia, and many hard edge inspired works that were produced in larger and more adventurous formats, and even foraying into early computer generated imagery with inkjet works that explored themes of the environment and one of her other great passions, cats. So whilst Brash's works were singled out by curators and critics of the era, including being the subject of solo exhibitions up until the 1980s, her highly original and exploratory practice hasn't been written into art history as we might have expected. As so often the case, some of the most interesting artists sort of lose the attention of the art world due to a variety of factors, amongst them being a certain taste for particular mediums arising at particular times, or the thematic and stylistic trajectory of contemporary art in general. So just as kind of a closing thought, in this way, we can see how Brash's work operated out of modernism's more obvious tenets, compelled instead by distinct individualism. And it was a quality that grew as her work matured. It was also forced by personal circumstance and her exclusion, chosen and otherwise, from galleries, societies, and artistic networks. And so we see in her later years, her practice was frequently drawn inward rather than outward into the realm of idiosyncrasy and often originality. And I thought I would just leave you with this slide, which provides a few quotes from an interview that Alan Sumner had with James Gleeson, just to kind of point out the kind of revision of art history that we can do now, looking at Brash's kind of really original and pioneering use of thermography, looking at these quotes by Alan Sumner today, in which he says he hasn't seen anything anew emerge in the medium. It's kind of an opportunity to revisit these kind of statements that are written into art history and do something about them in the format of exhibitions like Barbara Brash Holding Form. And I'll just leave you with two pictures of Brash, which I think just sums up her really creative personality, and one of her later works on the right-hand side that we see, alluding to the kind of inkjet period that she went through in her later years. And yeah, I think that's about it. Very happy to take questions, and thank you so much for joining me tonight.